So moving into the period after the Peloponnesian Wars, we'll look at some of the developments in Greece and the continued sort of internal conflict, and then eventually the rise of Macedon or Macedonia under Philip II. And I think this quote kind of effectively sums up a lot of what's happening during this period. What we'll sort of trace is just a lot of jockeying for position, still attempting to sort of establish dominance in the Greek world. Not just Sparta and Athens, but now we'll see sort of Thebes enter into the picture. But in part, the story here is those attempts to sort of establish their respective supremacy really did not end well, and just succeeded in sort of depleting their respective armies and their forces, which made them incredibly vulnerable to Philip when he comes down and attempts to establish control of mainland Greece. So in the immediate aftermath of the Peloponnesian Wars, what we saw was in 404, the Athenian fleet just destroyed by Sparta, their alliance with Persia, sort of effectively removing Athens from control of the Aegean and losing all of those sort of city-states that had been paying tribute. They also destroyed the democracy and put in place this government called the Tyranny of the 30, which was incredibly oppressive and repressive. And eventually then you have resistance amongst the Athenians led by a man named Thrasybulus. Thrasybulus had managed to escape Athens, and so he assembled sort of a small force, built a fortress at Phyle, which you can see kind of outside of Attica, and that became his base of operations. Gradually, other people who were also discontented with this really sort of repressive government that was just sort of killing people arbitrarily, seizing property, doing anything they could to sort of bolster their own position, sort of gravitated towards Thrasybulus. And so he had a significant enough force that eventually he's able to march on the Piraeus. He seizes the port first, and then they move into Athens and attack the Tyranny of the 30. Some of those men are killed in the sort of the skirmish. Some of them are exiled, but the government is established and the democracy is restored. And there is some sort of questions in this aftermath as to, what is sort of the appropriate way to deal with some of these developments. A lot of people want retribution, but they decide that really the best way forward is to declare an amnesty, which the original Greek term for that means non-remembering. So it's almost this deliberate decision to try and put the past behind them and attempt to move forward. So the other sort of development of this period that goes hand in hand with that is in 399, the trial of the philosopher Socrates. And Socrates had been a very visible figure during this period. Obviously, he was engaged in teaching some of the elite men within Athenian society. He would use sort of this distinctive questioning sort of pedagogical practice. And really what his belief was, to the extent that we know that, because he doesn't write anything himself, is that the study of philosophy just offers you this ability to sort of recognize what is good, and then it's only in sort of replacing ignorance with knowledge that we can achieve sort of good behavior and do the right thing. And so eventually he does developed quite a reputation for a number of things, but the official charge levied against him is subversion of religious traditions and then also sort of corrupting the youth. So these are pretty vague charges. Obviously, he stands trial. He puts up a pretty sort of lively defense of his own actions. But at the end of the day, really what seems to be coming into play here is because of earlier associations with individuals, particularly a man named Critias, who is part of the Tyranny of the 30, there is just this belief that Socrates has this association with that period and with the individuals who ruled with a tyranny of 30, and that somehow he's understood as sort of antithetical to democracy. So the people who are the most vocal critics during his trial are sort of the staunchest advocates of the return of democracy. And so in many ways, he's sort of a scapegoat, but just reflecting this sort of climate within Athens after this period. This is an image of the academy. This is actually where Plato, who tells us about Socrates, used to teach. It's this sort of sacred grove outside of Athens. Much of the buildings that were there have been destroyed, but you can still see sort of the ruins. So Sparta then continues to kind of make a case for its dominance in this Greek world, especially given the decline of Athens. And so they had allied with Persia to defeat Athens, but at this moment then they end that alliance with Persia and they actually organize an invasion force of Persia. They're sort of working to sort of destabilize the government in Persia at the time. They're not super successful in that. And so eventually, though, they also instigate what becomes known as the Corinthian War. And so what's happening here is that that Sparta invades Boeotia, which is, you can see it's near Attica. Sparta invades Boeotia. And so Athens, Corinth, which used to be a Spartan ally, Argos, and Thebes all form an alliance. They do have the support of Persia in the form of some money. And this is generally not like a war that's characterized by large-scale battles. It's mostly sort of smaller skirmishes. For the most part, the Spartans are not super successful on land. There are a couple of battles, but then it sort of ends up as sort of a stalemate. What does sort of have more of an impact is the sort of the naval battles that accompany this. And in particular, that fleet that Sparta has built during the end of the Peloponnesian Wars is defeated by an Athenian fleet. They have about 120 ships in that fleet and they lose almost every one of them. It's just annihilated. So Sparta had been sort of challenging Athens for control of the Aegean, but obviously without that fleet, it's not going to happen. So given these sort of reversals, they agree to what becomes known as the King's Peace. So this is negotiated primarily with Persia, and the goal is just to end this sort of internal conflict and to acknowledge the autonomy of the different sort of city-states. They do agree to give the Eastern Greek sort of Ionian city-states to Persia, and this is in part done because they do not want, as they sort of see their own decline, Athens to kind of reemerge as a power and rebuild their own empire. And so according to the terms of the King's Peace, it's Sparta that's entrusted with sort of maintaining this peace, though as we'll see, these pieces that they negotiate just don't have a lot of teeth and people just aren't really committed to them. They seem to be kind of temporary solutions, not a long-term vision of how these Greek city-states are going to coexist. So with the decline of Athens and especially of Sparta, we see the rise of a city-state that has been a player, but certainly not a dominant one, in Thebes. And so Theban hegemony speaks to this period between sort of the decline of Sparta and the rise of Macedonia. And so in 382, Sparta attempts to occupy the city of Thebes. They do not succeed in doing that, but they do occupy sort of the territory outside the city-state. They do this sort of annual invasions to sort of be very disruptive. And then sort of this pushes Athens, sort of in violation of that King's Peace, this pushes Athens into an alliance with Thebes. And so then Athens is able to provide the naval support. And ultimately, what we see then is this sort of conflict spills over into one of the large-scale battles that occurs during the period at Leuctra. So what Thebes has going for it is it has a brilliant general in Epaminondas. He's just an incredible military strategist. Unfortunately, we don't know as much about him as we would like. There just aren't the sources. But we do know that at the Battle of Leuctra, Cleombrotus, who is the king of Sparta at the time, and his army is just annihilated by Epaminondas. And Thebes is the home of the sacred band. So This is in particular sort of a fighting contingent where men are sort of paired up with each other. And the idea is sort of the ultimate loyalty. So I want to say there's 50 pairs of men, so 100 total. And this is really the center of the Theban army. And so Epaminondas and the Sacred Band, he combines the Sacred Band are infantry, hoplites, but the Thebans also have a pretty significant cavalry, and you can see that sort of depicted there, and then used very effectively to just really destroy the Spartan army, which is still reliant almost exclusively on hoplites. So they have added some cavalry. And so the Spartans, again, are just absolutely annihilated. They're able to field 700 Spartiates or Spartan equals. Of those, 400 are killed, including the king Cleombrotus himself. This is like a quarter of what the Spartan population has at this stage. So the number of Spartiates has just continued to decline. And this is the first sort of formal battle, infantry battle, land battle in 3 centuries that Sparta has lost. Unlike in the past, where survivors were basically deprived of their citizenship because they lost a battle, in this instance, it does not happen. They don't enforce those rules because the numbers are so low. So Thebes is able to then establish dominance. Epaminondas has a conference. They manage to then kind of dictate terms of peace to Sparta. And so Epaminondas affirms the king's peace and those terms, though Thebes replaces Sparta as sort of the city-state in Greece that's going to sort of police everybody else. He does affirm the autonomy of each of the city-states to try and prevent sort of another Athenian empire from emerging. The other thing that he does, which is just devastating to Sparta, is he moves into the Peloponnesus. He frees the Helots. And he establishes this city of Messene, which is pictured here in Messenia. So he dismantles the Spartan control of Messenia. He gives that to the Helots and to any Perioikoi who want it. And the loss of that amount of territory is just devastating to the Spartans. They also obviously lose that Helot population who had been sort of central to their ability to maintain the structure of their society and their economy. And then he dismantles the Peloponnesian League and tries to deprive Sparta of their allies. In 362, then, the Spartans attempt to challenge Thebes, and interestingly enough, they actually have the support in this instance of Athens. So Athens also doesn't like sort of how Thebes has become the dominant power. So Athens and Sparta combine forces. Thebes wins the battle, which we think occurs here at Mantinea. But Epaminondas himself is wounded, and his wound proves to be fatal. The 2 other generals fighting alongside him, who would have been logical successors, are also killed. And so in part, the effectiveness of Thebes is so dependent on their military, and in particular military leadership. Once they no longer have that sort of general, they themselves aren't really in a position to make a bid for maintaining their hegemony. But the Spartans themselves are completely depleted. Further losses are inflicted as a result of the Battle of Mantinea, and Athens just doesn't really have the resources to sort of argue for its ability to kind of take over leadership within the Greek world. So at the end of the day, the result of this internal conflict throughout the Peloponnesian Wars, as well as in the aftermath, is just sort of a devastation of all of these city-states across the Greek mainland, decline in populations, inability to field sort of significant numbers in terms of armies or in terms of navies, and they're so just depleted that they're completely vulnerable to Philip when he attempts to conquer. And so let's talk about Macedon or Macedonia. So the interesting thing about Macedonia is it's not really considered part of the Greek world. I think most people, when they think about Philip's son Alexander the Great, assume that he is Greek. The Greeks at the time would not have considered him that. They actually were pretty critical of the Macedonians. They viewed them as very backward. They had political systems and legal systems and religious traditions that the Greeks were very disdainful of. What they do have in common is language. So Macedonians are sort of these linguistic cousins of the mainland Greeks. And eventually, by the time of Philip, most elite Macedonians are speaking the same language as most of those Greeks would have been speaking. They also do adopt some customs in terms of dress, but there are certain things that really sort of set them apart. They aren't urban like most of these Greek city-states, right? It's very Macedonia, as you can see from the map here. It's just sort of on that southern border of Europe. And so it's open, it's grasslands, it's flatter, it's very rural, there's a lot of grazing that they engage in, so you don't have the same topography as you do in the rest of the Greek world. The other reason why they haven't really been an active player in a lot of these affairs is because of their frontier location. So you have these Celtic tribes in the north who periodically will try and raid into the south, and so Macedonia has provided sort of a buffer against those raids. The other sort of real distinction is their political system. So they still have a monarchy, and it's like a pretty absolute monarchy. So the king does have to come from a particular family, but the way they sort of understand who the king is really dependent upon his sort of individual attributes. So it's a very personal, charismatic monarchy. The king is understood as owning all of the land and natural resources, which then he kind of allows his subjects to use. The king in Macedonia is the commander of the army. He's also the one who makes, at the end of the day, all legal decisions. So he's an official judge. He makes all of their political decisions. He will sort of consult. It's sort of expected that there is an assembly of all men who bear arms, but it doesn't have any authority. So he'll sort of muster them and bring them together, just sort of a sign of sort of support. But they don't really have any political voice at all. He is also an important sort of religious figure, so he conducts a lot of important sort of ceremonies. The king then is assisted by sort of this companions, also known as his companion cavalry. These are sort of other elite Macedonian aristocrats who have trained, and they are sort of understood to kind of play this advisory role when the king sort of consults with them. It's sort of understood that he needs to have them all on board to do things, but if he doesn't have the support, he could move forward anyway. The other area that separates Macedonia from the rest of the Greek world is in their marital practices. Macedonians, especially their kings, are polygamous. So eventually Philip has something like 7 wives. A lot of these marriages are made as a result of sort of diplomatic alliances to kind of get support from local ruling families. And so that sort of sets them apart as well. Philip's first wife is Olympias. She is the sister of the ruler of Epirus, and so this is very much a diplomatic sort of union. So in terms of succession, these kings have to come from the Argead family. Typically, it is considered beneficial if the previous king will nominate his successor. So everybody sort of knows while that king is still alive who is going to replace them. And then the assembly sort of expresses their approval just sort of by shouting. But because there isn't a direct line of succession, there is a lot of instability, a lot of assassinations, a lot of sort of jockeying for position amongst that sort of highest sort of governing position. So one of the first things that Philip does in 360 when he succeeds his brother, and his brother was actually killed. We don't know the exact circumstances, but we know that Philip is happy to step into his shoes. Philip was actually raised in Thebes in the household of Epaminondas. And so in part, a lot of his military expertise comes from that influence. And so one of the first things he does is he reforms his army. He has managed to secure considerable resources, which I'll talk about in a second. And so he introduces the first sort of professional standing army in this Greek world. So he pays his soldiers, which means they can mobilize for extended periods of time. They're not like a citizen soldier who needs to tend to their farm. This is their occupation. And so they're subject to really vigorous training. He sort of he changes the phalanx up a little bit. He makes it deeper and wider, and then he adds what you see here, this sort of pike called the sarissa. The sarissa was about 16 feet, and so instead of with swords, the first 2 rows of the phalanx being able to engage directly in battle, like the first 5 rows of the Macedonian phalanx were able to engage in battle. And so you can imagine if you're encountering like a Spartan army with hoplites who just have their swords and maybe sort of a smaller spear, it's going to prevent that kind of close hand-to-hand combat that the Spartans excel in. He also makes the shield a little bit smaller to like lighten the load of the armor so that the infantry is a little bit more flexible. And then they do also have sort of a short sword in case they do engage in closer combat. He has his cavalry, so his companion cavalry. So looking at slightly more now diverse forms of warfare instead of just being completely reliant on the hoplite phalanx. This gives you a lot of flexibility and mobility. And he introduces an engineering corps. So this accompanies his army to do things like build siege devices. They have some sort of basic artillery. If you are engaged in conquest and you need to cross a river, they can build a bridge. He introduces this sort of new practice of royal pages. And this is particularly thinking about succession moving forward, but also bolstering his position. So what he does is he has, so the capital of Macedonia is at Pella. That's where the royal court is. And so he has the sons of all the sort of leading Macedonian families sent to Pella. So they're raised with Alexander, and so his designated heir as his oldest son. Well, I guess Alexander's not his oldest son. He has a son from another wife who has some sort of developmental disabilities. But Alexander is his heir. He's brought Aristotle from Athens to tutor Alexander. And so then Alexander and all of these other young men are sort of raised together and educated together at that royal court. And this is intended to provide sort of a close set of companions for Alexander in preparing for Alexander's succession. But also, if you think about it, all of these noble families have their sons at Philip's court. And so they also sort of serve as hostages to make sure that everyone maintains loyalty. So his first sort of focus in terms of expansion is in the north. So it's primarily north of Macedonia. He manages to conquer sort of that purple. So that's Upper Macedonia that was controlled by a group of people called the Illyrians. So he unites Upper and Lower Macedonia into a single entity. He also expands his control up into Thrace and neutralizes the Thracian population. In the 350s, he seizes Amphipolis and Potidea. Amphipolis in particular had been an Athenian possession, and so that loss is significant for them. In 339, he practices what becomes very common moving forward in terms of moving into an area clearing the existing population, establishing a new city, and then importing other settlers to kind of inhabit that place. So most of the cities that he establishes, he calls Philippi after himself. Alexander establishes a lot of Alexandrias. And so Philippi is an example of this. So he establishes this city-state as he conquers, and then he actually brings in about 20,000 Scythians who then manage to kind of farm the land and provide sort of stability and give him sort of more control of this particular region. So once he secures his borders in the north and expands his reach into Amphipolis, he turns his attention to mainland Greece. He has increasingly inserted himself into local disputes that engage the Greek city-states. With the absence of a clear sort of leader, there's a lot of sort of back and forth and looking for someone to kind of step into the void. And Philip does that. He's very charismatic. He's very diplomatic. And then this sort of insertion into Greek affairs kind of gives him a certain amount of leverage moving forward to kind of establish control over what's going on in the Greek world. There is real concern. Athens is aware of Philip's growing presence in Greek affairs, but Athens is still really recovering from the devastation of the sort of previous few decades. And so most of the leading voices in Athens, when they do express concern about Philip's ambition, they really maintain an isolationist stance. So Philip's not a threat, or if Philip is a threat, he's not a threat to us. We're too far south. Eventually, in part, because of some of the developments that are happening, in 346, they do negotiate what's called the Peace of Philocrates. And so this is sort of intended to reassure a lot of these city-states that Philip isn't going to militarily invade. Demosthenes is one of the sole voices in Athens who warns about Philip. He keeps warning about Philip. We need to take this threat seriously. He writes several really well-known speeches called Philippics that is trying to encourage the Athenians to really recognize this threat. Unfortunately for Demosthenes, who's pictured here, there are a number of other leading statesmen in Athens who are actually on Philip's payroll. So every time Demosthenes gives a speech warning about Philip's intention, someone else will stand up and say, Philip's our friend, we have nothing to fear. And so Philip's masterful use of sort of these diplomatic channels, as well as some of these more questionable means, really does allow him time to kind of strengthen his position. In 340, then, he attacks the Propontis, which is in the northeast of the Aegean. And that's important because it controls the grain routes, bringing grain from the Black Sea through the Hellespont to Athens. And as he attacks the Propontis, he manages to confiscate like 180 grain ships that were bringing much needed grain to Athens. And he confiscates the grain and then he sells the ships. So Athens breaks the Peace of Philocrates because they feel like they have no choice, and they sail with their feet up to the Propontis. They try and encircle Philip and prevent him from escaping, but he does manage to escape and to elude capture. And so he finds an alternative route sort of out of the Propontis. So Athens really doesn't accomplish anything. Philip's real intentions become very, very clear in 338 at the Battle of Chaeronea. And so Athens finally recognizes that something needs to happen, that they need to move forward in terms of a real sort of military challenge to Philip. And so they do form an alliance with Thebes and with Corinth, and they take to the field of battle. The combined allied forces are destroyed by Philip. You can see his son Alexander, who's only 16 at the time, Maybe he's 18 at the time. Alexander leads the cavalry charge, and Philip is able to just outmaneuver the Athenians and the Thebans. The sacred band itself is completely decimated. And after the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip is able to invade Laconia. And so this is the Peloponnesus. He puts a Macedonian garrison in the city-state of Corinth. He does establish an oligarchy in Thebes, so he replaces their democracy with some hand-picked men to kind of govern in Thebes. But for the most part, given the overwhelming victory that was Chaeronea, it is sort of surprising that Philip doesn't exact sort of more of a toll from these Greek city-states. And in part, the explanation for that seems to be because he is primarily sort of interested in just securing the area, because this is not his main focus. So his main focus is going to be making sure that these internal disputes in the Greek world are ended, and that he can rely on them and their support moving forward. So before Chaeronea, Philip had, so right after Chaeronea, in his attempt to sort of negotiate this sort of settlement, Philip holds a conference at Corinth. And so this is sort of the settlement of these affairs in the Greek world. So he gets all of these other Greek city-states to sort of affirm his leadership role and his role as president. They come to some sort of attempts to avoid continued internal strife and to unite against any external threats. He affirms the autonomy of each of the individual city-states within Greece. Obviously, Thebes is an exception. And then he has them sort of appoint him a commander-in-chief of an army, and he announces his intention to invade Persia. What's motivating Philip in this is not entirely clear. He seems to suggest that this is an attempt to free these eastern city-states that are still subject to Persian control. He also talks about sort of punishing Persia for those invasions that happened decades ago. Given the fact that Persia has been at times an ally of Sparta or Athens, that seems a little flimsy. He's primarily motivated by conquest, adding land, adding resources, and adding wealth. In 336, in preparation then for that invasion, he sends an advance force to Persia, led by one of his most trusted generals, Parmenio. He's going to sort of build necessary bridges and scout out the terrain and sort of lay the foundation for the much larger invasion force, which is going to happen in the spring. In the meantime, Philip is assassinated, and this kind of shocks the entire Greek world. This is what we know. He had married the daughter of another one of his Macedonian generals named Attalus. And unlike all of his other wives, this woman was actually Macedonian. So there's some suspicion that he may have, if he had a son from that union, removed Alexander from his position as successor and replaced him with this new son, because this new son would have been all Macedonian. There are other sort of events that alienate Alexander. He is told by Philip that he's not going on he's not going to be part of the invasionary force. He's going to stay back in Macedonia and govern in Philip's name. There is an event, very typical feasting. When these Macedonians feast, there's a lot of drinking. Philip is known for becoming really, really drunk on occasion, and it's sometimes violent. And there's a moment when Alexander says something at one of these feasts, and Philip gets up and he's really mad, and he's so drunk he trips and falls, and so he banishes Alexander and his mother from court. They do come back, but the relationships are really strained. There is a wedding celebration for Philip's daughter, Cleopatra, who is Alexander's sister. Cleopatra is going to be married, and so in the course of these wedding celebrations, Philip enters the main theater at Agae, which is sort of the ceremonial capital of Macedonia. As he does, one of his former bodyguards stabs him multiple times and kills him. In response to that, Philip's army tracks down the bodyguard and kills him before any sort of questioning or interrogation can happen. Why this guy killed Philip is unclear. The immediate explanation is that Philip had been involved in a sexual relationship with this guy, and I think he's like 19, so he's kind of still a boy. If Philip had been involved in a sexual relationship with him, it was very one-sided. The boy was in love with Philip. Philip was not in love back. So eventually he dismissed the boy and he gave the boy to his guards, and the boy was subject to some pretty brutal treatment. So this was purely a personal attempt at revenge. Other rumors circulate suggesting that perhaps Olympias and Alexander were behind the assassination of Philip to secure Alexander's succession to the throne. And we do know in the aftermath of Philip's death, Olympias kills Attalus, so Philip's brother-in-law. He kills Attalus' daughter, Philip's newest wife, and she had just given birth to a child, so Olympias kills Philip's child as well. And so there's some other challengers through the throne who are killed at the same time, paving the way for Alexander's succession. This is the tomb of Philip II. It's called the Vergina tomb. It's found near Aggai. It was excavated in 1977, and it was surprisingly intact. Unlike so many tombs during this period, had never been robbed. And so there are frescoes inside of Philip and Alexander, and incredibly wealthy grave goods buried there as well.